when we ask, what's wrong with the world and what's the solution, we get, as we have just experienced, different answers based on different perspectives. Take a look at this picture. What do you see? The most immediate thing.
I can see the old lady.
Old lady? This is a really old optical illusion, by the way. Most of you have probably run into it before. But I'm hearing young girl, old girl pretty frequently, and that's because for some people, one will stand out, and for some, the other will stand out. It's one of those things where they're actually both there. You just kind of have to look or think about something else for a minute and then look. It matters though. It depends though on your perspective. Did you say I see a dog? Yeah. Really?
Yes. Yeah.
Right, you have 8 seconds.
So the black is like the coat, and you've got a chin, and you've got the necklace on the young lady.
I'm glad I didn't do more than one. And we're moving on. It's possible to get stuck in a perspective, as demonstrated. Tonight we're going to consider both our own perspective on the world's problems and solutions, but also God's perspective. But let's start with ours. First, ours. Oh gosh, I don't have enough slides. Our perspective of ourselves. Imagine the ladder here is a scale that measures goodness. Absolute goodness is at the top. You know, perfection is at the top. The goodness of God sits at the top. And kind of the worst evil possibly imaginable is down at the bottom, right? Now, where, you know, if there was 10 rungs, I didn't count the rungs on my ladder, but if there was 10 rungs, where would you put Peter Malinauskas? Hey, you thought I was going to say you, didn't you? What about Albert Einstein? You know, he's a relatively popular guy historically, if you ignore the nuclear implications of the things he figured out, but he didn't do it himself. What about like a celebrity? What about a Robert Downey Jr.? People in the room who don't know who that is, that's okay. Anyone who does, where would you chuck him on the ladder? Down the bottom. Robert Downey Jr. is the problem with the world. All right. Well, where would you put you? You don't have to. Don't pick a run. Keep it to yourself. Please don't yell them out. This could get awkward. Most people will typically put themselves around a 7. Not perfect, but who is? You know, we all have a sense that we're, you know, that there's good and there's evil, and most of us think that we are basically good people. That's a pretty common perspective. But here's a question: where would Jesus put me on the ladder? And unfortunately, the answer, quite unambiguously in the Bible, is that he put me just down there at the bottom. And that's where he put you, and you, and all of us. How can that be? There's a sobering way to start, isn't there? Jesus says it's because we've misunderstood the nature of true goodness. Goodness. What makes a person good? You know what? Go back to groups. It's going to be awkward on the video feed, but take 2 minutes and just figure out for me a quick definition of what makes a person good. Go. I mean, all right. My seconds were a little bit unpredictable. It's true. They were not good. What do we get? I overheard a little bit of the conversation. I heard a bit of niceness. Nice was a word that popped up in more than one place, and morality popped up in more than one place. Has anyone got anything else to shout out? You know, give me a. You got 3 words to define goodness, simply for the sake of time. Go on, Eli. Follows the 10 Commandments. That was nearly 3.
The number doesn't count.
Follows the
the commandments. These are the best. So follow the Ten Commandments.
Well, Jesus asked that question once. Jesus got asked that question once, rather, and his answer has two parts. He didn't do it in 3 words, I should say. I'm not being very fair here. He said, love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind. This is the greatest commandment. And the second is like it, love your neighbour as yourself. When we consider what makes a person good, we almost, or maybe most naturally, always think of that second part, the neighbour part. We think of being good to other people, but less often, or maybe never, we think of the God part. But Jesus says that's the heart of goodness. That comes first. Something is truly good, a car, for instance, or a phone, or a friendship, when it works the way that it is made to work. You and I, we were designed to relate properly to each other, and we all know that. We're built for relationships, but even more importantly, we're made to relate properly to our God, to the one true God. To have him at the centre of your life. And the sobering perspective of the Bible is that none of us have loved God with all of our hearts. In fact, Jesus says something else is going on in our hearts. Most of us work pretty hard to present well to other people, as decent, moral people, as a good person, right? Okay, we've got our blemishes, but, we've got a good heart. Yet Jesus, he calls our bluff on that. He says, let me read this here. He said, what comes out of a person is what defiles him. For from within, out of the heart of a man, come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, coveting, wickedness, deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, foolishness. All these evil things come from within, and they defile a person. Jesus says that the heart of the world's problems is the problem of our hearts. They're evil. By heart, he means the core of who you are. Alexander, I'm not saying this right, Solzhenitsyn. One of these years I'm going to look that up and make sure I pronounce it correctly, but not this year. He was a Russian, as you may have guessed. He was under the communist regime of the USSR. He was a philosopher, he was a novelist, and he was a historian, and he actually got imprisoned by the Soviets for the stuff that he said. He was a person who also was integral in raising awareness to the rest of the world of the atrocities that happened under the USSR and the gulags. And he said this, actually, before I say what he said, if there was one person who maybe was justified in thinking the problem was other people, right? Probably this guy, who's been imprisoned and tortured by an evil regime. But he said this, if only it were so simple. If only there were evil people somewhere, I don't mean to point at you guys, insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and to destroy them, but the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. And who is willing to destroy a piece of his own heart? Imagine that I could put a GoPro camera not on top of your head, but inside of your heart. Now, there's obviously a little bit conceptual going on here. You would obviously die if this was true. But imagine that we could see everything going on inside there. And it recorded everything you did, everything you looked at, every word that you spoke. But more than that, it could record your silent thoughts. It could put words to them. It could uncover your motivations. Imagine I took all of that footage, just from the last week, let's say, keep it manageable, and put it on the screen here for everyone to see. How'd you feel about that? Not super psyched? I think I might be tempted to run, literally, from the room, screaming. Maybe doing my Kermit Arms on the way out. Why? Well, because I know I fail. I know I fail even on my standards of goodness. of what I know is right and good. If I fail on my own standards, how much more by God's standards? The Bible's perspective, which if we're honest, I think we suspect might be true, is that we're all far from good and far from God. And one day we're going to face God as judge. This is a pretty painful reality, but it's a real one. And he's going to find us guilty. We're on the wrong end of the ladder. We stand under God's judgment. That is the Bible's sobering perspective on humanity as a whole. So if we've failed God, many people then think, well, God, he's got a good rep. He's a loving guy. He's just going to forgive and forget, right? He can move on from it, and it'll be okay. Well, good news. God is loving, but he can't simply forgive and forget because he's a God of justice. You know, we understand the importance of justice, don't we? We even talked about this morning at church. If your house gets broken into, you understand the importance of justice. If your family get hurt, you understand the importance of justice. We're outraged when injustice is done. Yeah, imagine a man guilty of murdering one of your loved ones, right, is brought before the court with clear evidence presented showing that he's guilty. But the judge just says, you know what? I'm a loving and compassionate judge. I'm gonna let him go free. It's okay. We're moving on from this. Yeah, imagine the outrage at the injustice being done. On what grounds could a judge let the guilty go free? No, we want justice done. We want justice served for the evils committed against us. But the question is, do we want justice from God? Do we want him to hand out the fitting punishment for the way that we've treated him? See, here's God's dilemma. Faced with our rebellion towards him that each of us is involved in, he either shows us unjustified mercy or unmerciful justice. God is merciful and he will forgive sin. God is just and must punish sin. How can he be both at the same time? How can God forgive those who are guilty without denying justice? How can God punish us justly and yet be merciful? Can you start to see how God can't simply forgive and forget? Well, the good news is that God has one solution to the problem of our guilt and his desire to forgive. God has found a way to extend both justice and mercy, and the way is Jesus. Around the age of 33, Jesus fulfilled his life's mission by dying. He was abandoned by his followers. He was rejected by the leaders of his own religion. He was scorned by his own countrymen. He was condemned to death by Roman officials. Though he had found no guilt in him, he was whipped. He was scourged, which is a description of a type of whipping that involves brutal torture and has often been known to kill people in and of itself. He was led outside the city of Jerusalem carrying his cross. Nails were driven through his wrists and his feet. He was lifted up onto that cross. He would have moved between sagging and standing. As he hung naked, he was spat at and ridiculed as he struggled to breathe. Ultimate shame and excruciating pain are the description of what crucifixion is. And yet there was something far more distressing even than that taking place. when Jesus was crucified. Under the surface of enormous physical, emotional, and social pain, and as he came near to the point of death, Jesus cried out his final words. These final words tell us two important things about God: the love of God and the justice of God. These words they're recorded for us in Mark chapter 15. If you want to, you can grab one of those New Testaments there. I haven't marked the page down, which was foolish now to think about it. But it's on page 27.
Sorry.
I said corrected, 28. Mark 15, verse 34. And at the ninth hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? Jesus died, God forsaken. It's a term that speaks of horrifying separation when you actually think about it. Like when a precious relationship suddenly ends. I don't know if you've ever experienced something like that. The point the Bible is making is that at this moment, God himself was separated from his Son, the Father from the Son, a relationship that had existed in perfect unity for all of eternity. Perfect love, perfect intimacy was shattered apart in that moment. Jesus once said, the Father and I are one. Yet on the cross, something in the very fabric of God tears. Why would God do that to his perfect Son? And the answer is that Jesus suffered. Jesus was forsaken because of those two things, because of God's love and justice. God's justice won't allow him to leave evil unpunished. So in an amazing display of love, God took the punishment of sin upon himself. In the person of his Son, Jesus. It's God's love which satisfies his justice, you see. Most people's perspective of Jesus is that he was a good guy, he was a good man, a good teacher, a good man. He came to show us a better way to live. But that's not Jesus' understanding of himself, of what his life was about. Jesus wasn't just here to teach us better values and a better way to live. He tells us in Mark chapter 10, he says, that even the Son of Man, that's Jesus' name for himself, by the way, he uses it quite often, even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Jesus came to give his life as a ransom. A ransom, it's not a word that we use all that often these days. I think probably our main use of it is in like movies where people get held hostage. And it's not a terrible analogy. It's a price that is paid to rescue someone who is captive, who's in a dangerous situation that they can't get themselves out of. The debt we owe God is so great that only an infinitely valuable God is able to pay. Yet it's a debt that only man ought to pay, and so this infinitely valuable God becomes a man, Jesus. And he dies in the place of guilty mankind. He dies in the place of me and you. The Bible says, for our sake he made him to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. Imagine for a moment that this hand here is me. It's part of me, literally, but it's me. And this book is not the New Testament, but is a record of all of my sins. Now, ignore for the fact that it's fairly thin. It should be quite a bit bigger. Every lie, every lust, every violent act, every moment of hatred within my heart. There's the time that I took something that wasn't mine. There's all those moments of selfish motivation that I've looked out of. Because remember, Jesus reveals not just the actions, he reveals the heart of the person. In this book, this sin stands between me and God. Imagine for a moment that God is the ceiling. Please ignore the fact that we have a rubbish ceiling here at Gospel Church. I can't have the relationship with him that meets my deepest longings because I'm separated from him by my brokenness and sin. I'm separated from him, and I'm going to remain that way. Because I can't deal with this. I can't get this off. So imagine then that this hand is Jesus. He has no book of sin. Though he lived in the real world that we live in, and he was tempted in all of the ways that we are tempted to sin, he did not sin in his heart or in his actions. He's unique in that way. He always lived with God at the centre of his life. His words, his attitudes, his actions. Jesus has perfect, intimate relationship with God. And as he goes to the cross, what he does is he takes the book of my sin upon himself, standing in my place. And God pours out the just punishment that I deserve for all of my sin, with the result being that he was destroyed. He tasted hell himself on the cross. He died. No wonder Jesus cried out, "Has God forsaken us?" Right? But it was this act in history, this literal thing that happened, where God was demonstrating his love for sinners. The Bible says God shows his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Jesus' death, it affirms what we know to be true. We are guilty. Our guilt is real and it deserves punishment. We fall short of our own standards, let alone those of God. But Jesus' death also affirms what we long for to be true. We can breathe the fresh air of forgiveness. Be back in relationship with God as we were created to be. Friends, God offers us all this amazing gift of forgiveness, but like any gift, it has to be received. You have to step forward and take the gift. We're going to talk more about that in a later week. But tonight, I'm going to leave you with this question, a simple question. What would stop you from taking up an offer like this?